I'm Maria, and today I'm making sourdough bread. Sourdough bread is a hobby that I picked up in early quarantine because when we went to the stores initially, there was hardly any bread on the shelves, there was no yeast, and I had time, so I was bored in the house and in the house bored. So I made some starter and I got to work. The process to making sourdough bread is simple but time consuming, but it'll be well worth the effort, especially when your house smells so good. You're gonna need 3 basic ingredients: flour, water, and salt, because even your sourdough starter is just water and flour. That's it, 3 ingredients, pretty simple. This is the method of baking bread like our ancestors used to bake it. Simple, rustic, nice crusty bread. You just mix all of your ingredients in a bowl. After that, you auto-lyse for 30 minutes to 1 hour, and that just means leave it alone, let it rest. After that, you do 4 to 5 sets of stretch and folds, and you'll know how many sets you need to do or once your bread dough is developed enough, because I'll show you how to do a window pane test that you can use to know that you've adequately developed your bread proteins and that it's elastic enough to proceed. After adequate stretch and folds, then you bulk ferment for 3 to 6 hours, and bulk ferment just means let it rest. Again, this bread rests a lot, so be ready. After the bulk ferment, you shape it up, you get it in the proofing container where it's going to proof for at least 8 to 24 hours. I just proof mine overnight and then bake it the next morning, so in the morning my house smells like warm bread. To bake it, you'll heat up your oven with whatever container you're going to use to bake your bread in. You heat that up as well. That way you invert your dough onto a hot container. You cut your slit, which is where the bread is mainly going to expand from. After that, you cook it covered for 35 minutes. After the 35-minute cooking period with the bread covered, you uncover it and allow it to bake at a lower temperature for another 20 minutes. Then you cool and just enjoy it. You may be thinking, everyone in quarantine is making sourdough bread. That's so basic. Well, to quote one of the great philosophers, Jackie Aina, is being basic a crime? And the bread's still good.
Remember to wash your hands for at least 20 seconds with soap and water.
I will also provide measurements in cups in case you do not have a scale. We're going to be using 100 grams of starter. This is good active starter. There's the line I marked from when I fed it last, and you can see the bubbles in there. It's nice and working and active. It's more than doubled in size. 260 grams of water. And then for flour, we're going to be using a total of 384 grams. 128 grams are going to be whole wheat flour, and then 256 grams are going to be all-purpose flour. I like doing a mixture of flours, whole wheat, and an all-purpose because the whole wheat gives it a nicer flavor, more depth, but the all-purpose gives it a better texture because too much whole wheat flour, sometimes your gluten doesn't develop just right. And then 10 grams of salt. These ingredients are enough for 1 loaf. If you want to make 2 loaves, then go ahead and double your recipe. There's just not that many people in my house. If you have 101 grams, that's okay. And I'm going to go ahead and add my 260 grams of water and mix it in with the starter. It'll just make mixing easier. 0 our scale again, and 260 grams. Just go ahead and dissolve that starter into that water. My starter is a whole wheat starter. As I mentioned before, I did make it myself. Just flour and water and thyme, and then you will cultivate that wild yeast that are already living on that flour. 0 the scale again. And now we add our flour. So I have my measuring cup here. 0 it again, and then 128 grams of whole wheat flour. And 10 grams of salt. That's it for the ingredients. Now we just mix this up, and it's not going to be a nice smooth dough at this point. We just want to get the ingredients combined and then set it aside to auto-lyse for 30 minutes to an hour. And this is just going to be a rough dough, nothing nice and smooth. So there we are, a rough dough, just a messy entanglement, and we set it aside to let it auto-lyse for 30 minutes to an hour. I like to use these disposable shower caps to cover my bread with. It makes it nice and easy. The elastic keeps it on there, but you can use a kitchen towel or plastic wrap, whatever you have. Now I'm going to feed my starter. I saw on many YouTube videos and a lot of people name their starters, so I named mine Dr. Jemison. Dr. Jemison is an engineer, physician, and former NASA astronaut. She was the first Black woman to make it into space in 1992. So she rose up real high. I want my bread to rise up real high, so that's her name. To feed it, I'm going to do 40 grams of flour and 40 grams of water. 41. Not as perfect as I like, but it'll do. And then 40 grams of water. You want to do equal parts in weight. And just stir it up and set it aside until its next use. I'll probably store mine in the fridge because it's going to be at least 2 weeks until I bake another loaf of bread. Unless we make pizza, then I'll dig it out sooner. But whenever I'm going to use it, I just take it out of the fridge 2 days before I need it. And then that way I can give it at least 2 feedings and get it nice and ready and active. My bread has out of life for about 35 minutes. It's time to do our first set of stretch and folds. And as I mentioned before, this dough is going to be fairly sticky. And you just get underneath, stretch it, bring it over. Then there underneath, stretch it, and bring it over. And just do that a few times to start developing that gluten. Every time you touch your dough, it's going to feel a little more elastic, a little more rubbery. It's just going to start forming a ball more and more. And sourdough is a bread everyone can make. The ingredients are accessible and it's pretty forgiving as long as you start with a good active sourdough starter. I was talking to my mom about it when I first started making it, and she was like, oh yeah, in Spanish, sourdough bread, the sourdough starter is called masa madre or masa fermentada. I was like, oh, that's interesting, because I don't really remember us making it when we were kids. But it's not like as kids we weren't going to ask for sourdough. You know, we were going to ask for some pan dulce, some conchas. But now as an adult, I really have an appreciation for the more savory things. First set of stretch and folds done. We'll let it rest for 30 minutes and then come back and do another set of stretch and folds. We'll let it rest for 30 minutes and come back and do another set of stretch and folds. Second set of stretch and folds. With clean hands, make sure you're washing them. Same thing again. Just get in, grab some of the dough, stretch it, and bring it over. As I mentioned before, this is some pretty wet dough. Very sticky. Because this process is pretty time consuming, you can start it and make it work around your schedule. If at any time you needed to stop to go somewhere or do anything, if you need to kind of halt the process, just cover it and stick it in the fridge and come back to it. Like if I really needed to at this point, if I didn't have time for more stretch and fold and to proceed with the rest of the procedure, cover it, pop it in the fridge, come back to it when I can. As long as you're getting back to it within 8 to 12 hours, you should be just fine. See, and that's already starting to ball up and come together. Second set of stretch and folds done. We'll cover it back up and let it rest for another 30 minutes. Third set of stretch and folds. And this is a very sticky, wet dough. It's definitely a wetter dough than up for use for other breads. I'm talking wad. That's some wet ash dough. This song is real catchy. It's real dirty, but it's real catchy. Alright, third set done. Hopefully the next set will be our last, but we will do the window pane test to check. Otherwise we'll have to do a fifth set. Now I let it rest for another 30 minutes. Stretch and fold number 4. So at this point the dough is very nice and elastic. It's really balling up together, kind of wanting to come together and stay together, balling up on itself. That's definitely what you want to see. Every time you touch the dough, as I mentioned, it's going to be a little bit different, a little more elastic, a little more developed. It should come off of the edges of your bowl pretty easily as it's getting more and more, as more and more of that gluten gets developed. Because the gluten is a protein that helps make it more elastic. And even people with some mild gluten sensitivities can eat sourdough bread because the yeast and fermentation activity tend to break some of those wheat proteins down, which makes it more tolerable. It also makes it to where you can absorb more of the nutrients in your GI system because of that activity from the yeast. All right, our dough looks ready to go ahead and do our window pane test. You take some dough between your hands like that, and then you come to my window. You just stretch it out till it's thin and you get a little light shining through, but your dough doesn't rip. And that looks pretty good. That lets me know that I don't need to do a 5th set of stretch and hold. If when you stretch your dough out at home, it tends to rip easily, then you need to do another set or two until enough gluten is developed to it, so it's elastic enough to hold basically a thin pane. Now I'm going to let it bulk ferment for 3 to 6 hours. And with sourdough, you're not going to want it to double in size. It doesn't work fast like that. You just want to see activity and you want to see your dough growing. And there are a couple of variables that are going to determine how long you need to let your dough bulk ferment for. For example, the temperature of your kitchen, how active was your starter, how much does your active starter like the flours that you picked to use, because some flours are more nutritious than others and the yeast really like those. So it really varies. There's no set time on this one. I'm going to let mine rest. I'll check it in 3 hours and then again at 4 if it needs a little more time, and so on and so forth. In the meantime, I'll just do something else, something not exciting, probably clean my kitchen or clean another part of my house. You better grow. Don't be making me look bad. My bread bulk fermented for 3 hours and it's starting to look pretty good. There's definitely some growth of my bread that we have so far. The wet, sticky dough. You have to remember to bring a spatula and a scraper for this wet ash dough. Spread a little bit of flour to make sure that your dough doesn't stick to your working surface. Use your spatula to unstick the sides of your dough, and it's actually better if it's a little bit wet. The dough will stick less to a wet surface. Dump it out of the container. Nice, unstuck pretty easily. Make sure your fingers are floured so the dough doesn't stick to your finger. Ensure that your dough isn't going to stick to your counter. The last thing you want is to do all that work and then have your dough stick. We're going to do similar folding method as we did for the stretch and folds. So you take it, stretch it, and bring it over. Take it, stretch it, and bring it over. Take it, stretch it, and bring it over. Do that a couple more times. There we go. Put down some more flour. What's on the top now is the seam side of the bread, and the underside is actually going to end up being the top. Now, using the scraper, I'm going to put my bread down, flip it, and reverse it. So seam side is now down. Once your seam side is down, you have to let it rest for another 20 minutes. And I am just going to use my nifty old thing again. Give it a light cover here. Again, you can use a kitchen towel or some plastic wrap, just lay it on top, whichever. We let it rest for 20 minutes and come back for our final shaping. The dough rested for 20 minutes. Take my bench scraper again, and then put my bread down, flip it and reverse it one more time. And we're going to do the same thing as before, just a little tighter. Take it at the top, stretch it over, bring it down, then the side. It's really starting to come together. It's not sticking to my counter as much either. And one last time, grab it from the top. I'm really increasing the surface tension on what's going to end up being the top. Alright, I'm gonna move it into a sprinkle some more flour on the counter because that's getting pretty sticky. And you want to be pretty gentle because you don't want to get rid of any of the gases or bubbles that started building up in the dough. So that's why we do a folding versus a kneading process. I'm just kind of bringing the seams in on themselves. The way we use the scraper is we just kind of come in on the side, bring it in, and then bring it back towards you. Bring it in on the side, bring your dough in. So what we're doing is increasing the surface tension on the top part here of our loaf. You can also do it by hand if you don't have a bench scraper. Kind of just, and then bring it back towards you. So get your hand on there and bring it back towards you. Get your hand on there. It's pretty good, decently tight. If you have a banneton or a basket to proof in, a lot of people line that with a towel, linen, cloth or something, dust it with flour, then invert your loaf onto it. That method I have not had work for me yet. My dough always gets into the fibers of the cloth because once it expands, it really gets in there. But I found that for me, it's just easier to take my proofing dish and oil it up. Sprinkle flour and just tap it around. You want to do a generous coating of flour because that's what's going to keep your bread, your dough from sticking to the dish, and it'll make it a lot easier for you in the morning. I'm actually going to put a little bit more. Even if you have excess flour in there, you can just brush it off with your dough in the morning. Better to have excess flour in there to keep your dough from sticking than to not have enough. Again, you can just brush it off before you bake it. And drop it in. I'm going to cover it again, and now I'm going to place it in the fridge to proof for 8 to 24 hours. I'm just going to leave it in there until tomorrow morning when I bake it. Good morning. So we're up at the butt crack of dawn to be bakers, except it's a little after 8 a.m. so not quite. My hubby and I are going bike riding today at Venice Beach, doing the boardwalk, so I'm pretty excited about that. So we're going bike riding. We're wearing our masks. So let's get our bread ready and prepped to go in the oven. Bread out of the fridge, it proofed for about 16 hours. I have a little cornmeal here for dusting, just to keep our bread from sticking to our aluminum foil. I'm going to use aluminum foil. Most recipes call for parchment paper. If you have it, use it. I didn't have any, and I didn't feel like running to the store for one thing. I figure I'll just use foil instead. My Dutch oven, which I'm going to use to bake the bread in, and a very sharp knife to cut our slits. I'm going to pop the Dutch oven into the big oven and let it heat up. I set my oven to 500 degrees, so that's already warming up. This just has to go in there to get hot as well. We'll let that heat up and we'll be back once it's ready. The oven is now hot. I am going to take the Dutch oven out very carefully because it's hot and prepare my dough to put it on there. I'll leave the lid in the oven. Always ensure you have clean hands. I'm just going to unstick my dough. And that should come up pretty easily because we floured it generously. And when you do this, you should see that your dough springs back a little bit, but not completely. If your dough springs back completely, you're overproofed. If you don't have any spring back, you're underproofed. Sprinkle my cornmeal, just a little bit, not too much. There you go. Now we invert. Give that dough time to just come off on its own. It's sticking pretty well. Now I cut my slit, and you want to hold your knife at an angle. That way you get a good ear on your bread. So brush up on those surgical skills. Get one swipe from one end of the bread, and then same thing. I'm going to do 2 slits. Once you cut your slits, you want to get it in the oven pretty fast. Again, being super careful because this is hot. Put your lid back on it. Now we bake for 35 minutes at 500 degrees, covered. The oven timer sounded for the initial 35-minute bake. Let's cut to the oven and see what we have, because you never know what you're going to have with sourdough until you remove that lid. So this is the moment of truth. Look at that. I will lower our oven temperature to 425 and bake for 20 more minutes. The oven timer sounded, we're done baking, now we just have to let it cool. That's what we have out of the oven. So that second bake uncovered is where you really develop the bread's melanin and get it nice and dark and crusty on the outside. That looks really pretty. Now the hardest part, waiting for it to cool. I waited as long as I could. It's still a little bit warm, but you can touch it with your hands without being burnt at all. I'm going to separate the bread from the foil, and it should remove pretty easily because we use the cornmeal. Okay. Look at that. Nice. All right, let's get into this. And I know on a lot of videos they cut right in the middle. I don't want to do that. I don't want to ruin my bread like that. I don't know. I'm gonna cut from the edge. You can see on this side, I had the angle of my knife a little bit better because you get a little more ear. Where this side, I must have been more vertical. It's still got spreading there, but it's not. There we go. Nice big bubbles on the inside. Let's taste it. I don't know if you guys know about this butter, this Irish butter. It is so good. I definitely recommend it. I wouldn't have thought that you could taste the difference in butter because butter's butter, but no, there's a definite difference. Want to taste it?
Yes. Which is a dumb question because you know I was gonna. I'm not just gonna let you bake bread and not taste it. Mmm. Delicious.
You guys should definitely try making this at home.